I'd like to welcome my participants of my Daf Yomi Share and people around the world, whether you're listening on Torah Anytime or you're listening to any Daf Yomi Share around the world, and especially those that are listening to my share on my app or on Spotify or on the WhatsApp. Thank you for joining us. And it's a very exciting idea that we had, that as we start the third Perek in Masechta Sukkah, which is Lulav HaGozel, which goes through many of the halachas of Daled Minim, and it's an incredible thing that it's starting right before the Yom Tov of Sukkah. So only a few more weeks, we're going to be checking, we're going to be choosing our Daled Minim. And in order to know what to do, I want to teach you some of the halachas based on the daf that we are learning. So what we're going to be doing, Be'ez Hashem, is we're going to be putting out these videos based on the daf with some halacha lemaisa, very practical tips, practical ideas, slideshow, pictures in a very real way to help you be able to not only know the daf and to understand what it's saying, but also to come to the Yom Tov of Sukkot with a greater understanding of what the Daled Minim are and how to choose the best set. B'siyata Dishmaya. If you want to sponsor a future video in this series, so just send an email, office@beisdavid.com. That's office@beisdavid, B-E-I-S, David.com. So we begin b'siyata d'shmaya, the Mishnah on Daf Chof Tes Omid Beis. That's where we're holding over here. And the Mishnah, as we know, Lulav HaGozel, v'hayovesh posel. So let's go through some of the halachas which could be nageya. First, we'll start like this. Where does it come from in the Torah? And the Torah tells us clearly, "Ulakachtem lachem b'yoyim harishon pre-eitz hoda v'kapois tmorim v'anaf eitz avos v'arvei nachal." And from here we learn, and we'll see Be'ez Hashem in the dafim coming up, very, very exciting, that there are all the halachas, esrog, lulav, hadassim, and arovas are all learned from this pasuk. Pre-eitz hoda is the esrog, kapois tmorim is the lulav, Anaf Eitz Ovos is the Hadassim, and the Arvei Nachal is the Arovas, which we will explain exactly where does it come from. What's also interesting to note is that even though it says Ulakachtam Lachem B'Yom Harishon pre-Eitz Hodar, so the Hodar is only said in the pasuk in regards to Esrog. However, it actually refers to all of the Daled Minim. So the word Hodar applies to not only the Esrog but also the Lulav and the Hadassim and the Arovas as well, that it's important to know. Now, I want to mention to you something which is also very important, and that is there are two types of hodor. There's a hodor in the pasuk, pre-eitz hodor, that is ma'akev. That means if you don't have that, it's not good. And you have another type of hodor, which we'll see from Rashi, ze keli vanveu, right? Pasuk in Os Yoshe, that they beautified the mitzvahs, and that's what we're instructed to do with the Daled Minim, to beautify, to make the mitzvah as beautiful as we possibly can, but of course it's not ma'akiv. Okay, so that is the first idea that we have to mention. As a little bit of an introduction, I want to just bring you some interesting chazals. There's a Mordecai Medrash. The Medrash says, Kol ha'makayim mitzvahs esrog al shloishes minim. Anybody that's makayim, they're all four minim. Oile leminyan tariag. Says the Medrash, it's as if, because it's 610 and 3, as if you're Mekayim all 613 mitzvahs. The Medrash in Vayikra Rabbah, ha-mitzvah lakachas arbas haminim nirim ktanim be'inei yodim. What does it look like? Big deal. You pick up a lulav and an esrog and you shake it. It looks like it's nothing. But they're incredible in front of the Rabbeinu Shalom. Says the Maril, the B'Kor Yaakov brings it. Mi shekoine esrogim lulav yofim, beautiful ones. Says the Shloah Kodesh, think about it carefully. With a lot of exertion, with sweat, of a domim, you carve a lot of money. The Shem Hiddur Mitzvah. The Yilei Sa'irus Gadol Beliba, he will cause a tremendous arousing awakening in his heart. The Yishuv El Hashem Yachmeu. The Yismach Yisrael by say, isn't that incredible lashon that we find? The last one, the Gemara Sukkah, we'll get to. Be'ez Hashem Omer of Avo Kol Anoita Lulav Ba'oidev Hadas Ba'avoisai Ma'al Olav Akosu Kiru Bonam Mizbeach the Hikriv of Korban Shnem Yisrochar Ba'Beis Makanas on Mizbeach. So we're talking about a mitzvah that is not a stam mitzvah. It's an incredible mitzvah. It has a tremendous amount of power in it as well. But we have to know the halachas. So we're learning the Gemaras. We've opened up Gemara Chavtes, begins the Mishnah, and we're going to go through some of the halachas that we find in this Mishnah. So let's go through the journey, and let's start. Al Pi the Seder, the daf today is Chavtes. Omid base, we start talking about the lulav. That's what it's all about. Okay. So when discussing the lulav, the pasuk, as we learned, said b'kapois tumorim. Hakapois tumorim. This is a lulav tree. Right now, over here, it's interesting because the Gemara later on will have a suffix. How do we know that the esrog we have is the same esrog that the Gemara was talking about? And the Gemara will get to it. We'll talk about it. But when it comes to lulav, there is no suffix. It's kapois tumorim. It's on a decal. That tumorim, that dates, basically grow. And that is the mitzvah. Now, there's an interesting question. Does that mean that my lulav has to specifically come from a tree that actually produces dates? So it's interesting. The Hadigach Sam Soifa, which is later on the Gemara in Sukkah Lamadalit, with Moshe Paskins this way in Arachaim Chelik Dalit Simon Chofalev Sikot and Zayin, that says that Avad and Avad the Torah Kappas Tumorim, but not to tell me that it has to grow dates on it, but it has to show us the min, the species, the type of tree, but it's not a Tanai in the Hersha, which means to say that even if, and by the way, most of our lulavim come from trees that actually don't produce lemaisa dates, it's 1,000% kosher without any problem whatsoever. There are, by the way, there's a rugged shova in Sapras Paneach on the Rambam in Perek Zayin Alocha Aleph. There's a Minkatcha and Minchas Aloza Chilekei. There's a Binyan Sian b'shem Shloima. Many that say that there's a minion, an Indian to be machmim and daktik. The mitzvahs only take them a deco that actually produce tomorrow. It's interesting. I have seen in the marketplaces sometimes that they will actually bring in lulavim, and they will write on it that this is specifically that grows tomorrow. It grows dates in there, but it's a chumra ba'alma mikadin 100% any of our lulavim are kosher, and that's an important thing to remember. In fact, Mordek is to remember the lulav. Lulav is made of basically two sets of letters, right? You've got the Lamed Vav and you've got the Lamed Base. Lamed Vav Sadikim, Lamed Vav Mesachtas and Shas, of which one of them we're going through right now. Lamed Base, the Torah begins with base and ends with a Lamed. There's so much on this, it's incredible. I must mention to you as well, there's a Mordek Baril, Lulav, the Gematria Chaim. Okay. So this is a practical lulav tree, of which most of our lulavim are okay. However, I want to mention before we move on to the actual Mishnah, that there's another type of lulav to watch out for. Okay, this is a classic lulav tree that has the dates, as you can see, going down over there. This is a lulav where after it's grown very much and the leaves spread apart. We'll talk about it in Nifetzu Olav. Yeah, of course, there's a lot to discuss for Izar Hashem. And the lulav, the way it actually begins, the Torah actually discusses this in the beginning of the halachas of Hilchas Lulav, which, by the way, in Siman Tov Reish Mem Hey is the Siman we're dealing with today. And that is that it begins with a stick that grows very, very hard and long, like what we have, that the lulav that we use. And eventually the leaves open up to what we would use pretty much as Succah. So that's that. Now, here's an example of a lulav in its, in beginning form, which eventually translates into that on the left. Now, there's another lulav called a canary. A canary is a very different type of lulav, right? The shaila came about in Eretz Yisrael about more than 100 years ago, and it's a huge shaila in the poskim. Rav Moshe, look at this tshuva. Rav Moshe Norchaim Chalidalis Sim Kufchav Gimel. La Ania Staiti. Poshut ubor she'ein zeh meaning lulav klal. It's not even a lulav. Va'af b'di eved ein yitzim boy. You're not even yitza. Ubrocha levatala. Shtaka l'shainis from Rav Moshe. These people that do it, the machshel, the rabbim, and Shem Yirachem, what he talks about. It's mamash a broomstick. As I pass Rav Moshe. Rav Shlomo Zalman, interesting enough, and Halicha Shlomo Chelik Yud brought down that it's kosher. And there's a Tzitz Eliezer and Chelik Ches that goes that way also. But the shayla basically is that it comes from a different type of tree. And most poskim lemaisa, by the way, go with Rav Moshe and hold that it's Apostle Gomer, Rav Chaim Kanievsky, Shlita Paskin that way. Rav Yasher Paskin that way. The Stapler Paskin that way. Rav Moshe Sternberg, Rav Chaim Toivim, Rav Moshe Sternberg also Paskin is that way as well. In fact, with the Shevet Halevi, Rav Vosner, brought down in mid-base Levi, because that if a person made a bracha on it, you should actually make another bracha on another lulav. So you're dealing with something which, again, came around about 100 years ago. When I remember speaking to Rabbi Israel Orbach about it, so he told me we don't generally have to be choishish because you'd know about it. And he gave me 3 simonim. which I want to share with you. And four simonim, actually. Four simonim are like this. Number one, the distance between the leaves is much more than the daled minim, than the lulav that we have where it's packed together, which we'll get to and we'll discuss and we'll see. Number two, the spine is much, much softer than a canary, which means when you hold it straight, it sort of flops down. Number three, it's got a much smaller spine, and also there's a lot of dust between the leaves. Now, you don't have to generally assume that's a canary, but that's why it's always good to have one with a hechsher, because this way you know it's 100% kosher. Now, this is a machlokes I want to mention to you, but we're going to go back into it in more arichos soon. And that is, there's a machlokes between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, which actually is a machlokes, huge machlokes in the Rishonim, which, like I said, I'm not going to go into the sugya now, but whenever it talks about the leaves or the tiyomes, what the leaves being possible, and one of the things we're going to get to soon, and we'll talk about that when we talk about that it's split, that it's cut open, that it's cut off, all these sorts of things. So what exactly is it referring to? So many Rishonim, including the Rif, the Rambam, the Ran, the Rosh, the Ravid, the Ramban, many hold, and this, by the way, is the psak of the Shulchan Aruch, is Roiv. That means whatever the psul of the Mishnah is, it has to apply to the majority of leaves. And if you don't have it on the majority of leaves, then your lulav is kosher. And that's the psak of the Shulchan Aruch. L'maisa Rashi, the guy's a smak, other Rishonim, which is the psak l'maisa of the Ramah, Tofresh Mem Hesiv Gimel, paskins that it's only the Tiyomis, and that's the minig of Ashkenazim, that whenever we say, I'll give you an example. Our Mishnah, right, Chav Tesem Beis says, one of the things is nektam roishay, right? The head is cut off, which we'll talk about in a moment. Roishay of what? The whole of part of it. So again, the Shulchan Aruch would say roiv of the leaves are cut off, which basically means that it will be okay. In most cases, it's unusual to have such a lulav. The Ramah, on the other hand, holds only the tiyomis, which means it's much more of a chumrah because it's much easier to find. But again, we're going to discuss that, Be'ezah Hashem, when we get to that. Let's move on to one of the things that the Mishnah says in our daf today, Chav Tesem Beis, Nifredu Lov, it's kosher, right? So it's interesting. The Gemara later on, we'll see in Lamed Beis and Aleph learns, and the Lashon of Pasuk is kapois tomorrow. So lulav has to be right to be bound together, right? As the leaves to the spine have to be that way. But if you have the leaves are spread out, so lemaisa, it could be it's a shaila only if you cannot tie it together. Now, most of our lulavim don't have such a shaila, and the way we know a lulav is made up is specifically it's actually made of two leaves, right, that are bound together by the spine over there. That's how it is. However, as I just saw before from the Ramah paskins that even though most of our lulavim, even a lulav like this would be okay, of a mitzvah and a muvcha b'lulav she'ein alav brudas gamri, that it doesn't go out too much, it should be tight, which is the Ma'aseh, the Maggid Mishnah, the Ramah and Sif Aleph and Toklesh Memhei. Mishabur brings it b'shein the Maimon Montcha, the Yavitz, the Aruch HaShulchan, Sif Gimel, the Nashon, the Pri Megadim, and others as well. And therefore, most of our lulavim, by the way, I will tell you, is absolutely fine. In fact, I asked Rabbi Zilobach Shlita one time, what happens? Sometimes you hold the lulav and some of the leaves sort of shake off. And he said to me, it's fine. As long as generally they're all packed together and it's okay, there's no problem whatsoever. And therefore it's fine. And you included in this wonderful milah of our lulavim, and that's absolutely fine. So our lulavim will pretty much be okay. The other interesting shaila that we have, and again, it's our Mishnah Chav Tesem Beis, the Mishnah begins with this, is lulav hagozl v'hayavish. What does yavish mean? Right? It's an interesting shaila. What exactly is the geder of yavish? When we say yavish, what does yavish actually mean? So Tosfos in our daf tells us that so you can crumble it with your nail. That's what it is. The Rosh brings a razah that says that yavish means it's almost like it's withering away. It's almost like we don't have such a yavish of this year. Like imagine, for example, this is a regular lulav and this will be a lulav fight, be yavish. It's like almost totally white. Any lulav of this year would never fall into yavish. I'll give you an example. Let's say, for example, you get the Rebbe's lulav. Can you imagine they give you after Yom Tov the Rebbe's lulav, and you take it and you store it. By the time it gets next year, I want to use the Rebbe's lulav. Beautiful, but it might be dry, it might be yavish. That's when the shaila is. But most of our lulavim don't fall into this category. It's like a white like this, maybe. But otherwise, like I said, most of our lulavim don't have this shaila. Interesting question. That sometimes at the tip of the lulav, it's like sort of like brown. Sometimes it's reddish, sometimes it's brown. And the question is, what din does that have? What din does that have? So the answer is the Chazon Ish says it's 100% kosher. And the reason is because it's exposed to the sun more over there. And the tips obviously are more sensitive and they're much thinner. And therefore it gets a little bit, so to speak, burnt from the sun. But it's 100% kosher. That is not a problem. That's not called Yovish. And that is fine. Next, the Shaila that the Mishnah says, Nektam Roshoi. That means the top is cut off. That's what the Mishnah tells us. Now we have to understand, what does this mean exactly? First of all, what is the Roshoi? Right, and we've explained already. Tosfos, for example, is of the opinion that if the two of the leaves, or the middle leaves that are coming out from the head of the shedra, that's what it is. Rashi says over here, posel deloy habi hoder. It's not hoder. Now, obviously, over the hoder over here is not just beautiful, but hoder over here means it's actually missing something, and that's why it's problematic, right? That's what Rashi tells us, and that, by the way, means that all 7 days of Yom Tov, it's actually going to be posel. The Ravid says that it's actually a leaf and some of the shedra. The Balaita says it's 3 leaves are cut off. The Rosh, as I told you, is 2 middle leaves, and the Ritva and the Ran basically says it's the middle leaf, which is the psak of the Ramah and the Mishnah Berurah and the Ashkenazim, which means the middle leaf, the Tiyomes, which we would explain next time in much more detail how to figure out what is the Tiyomes. If that leaf is Nektam Roshai, then it's going to be possible. And I have to tell you, it's not easy to find. Baruch Hashem, I was able to spend many hours with that going Ramodcha Friedlander Zatzal, who was one of the biggest Bekim in Daled Minim, one of the first Rabbonim over here in Zupnik and Eretz Yisrael to Paskin Shilas in Daled Minim. He had Shemesh from Rabbi Yashuv, and Baruch Hashem, I sat with him for many years on Daled Minim and Stam and other things. But one of the things that he taught me was that how to look over here. It's not simple. It's definitely not simple, because you're looking at the Tiyomis, you've got to find the Tiyomis, you've got to find that it's actually Nektam, and that's what it is. Now, it's interesting because over here, Mr. Burr brings this halacha l'maisa b'shem b'levush, we're more machmeh than all of the other psulim of the things that we're going to discuss, because here we're machmeh even with the mashu. Normally, there's a sheh. Here, even a mashu is cut off. It's considered to be possible, which is be'etzim shittas haritva, the Ran, the Magid Mishnah, as I told you, the Vilna Gaon, the Levush, the Bekur Yaakov, the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Chai Odom, koshu. Why? Why is it that we're more machmeh here than anywhere else? And the answer is the Ran. The Ran says, which we will explain. The chaitim of the esrog is the most choshev, the sloping, the area, the top, the crown of the esrog is the most choshev. And therefore the head of the lulav is like the chaitim of the esrog. Ma chaitim shel esrog posel b'mashu. Avroisha shel lulav is also b'mashu. There's another thing. Rashi in Sukkah Lamed Hey, we'll get to on the base, talks about this is the place that everyone can see. And that's why we're more makbid with it over here, and that's why it's important for a person to remember and to see that this is the situation. Again, it's important to know how to look at it, right? It's not something that an amateur can look at it. That's what it is. I'll give you an example. That's okay. That's one of the things, by the way, that the reason why some people have the top leaf of Tiyomis that's bending us down. We'll talk about that koffer if we'll get into the whole suga. There's a famous stipler, but the reason is because then you see clearly that it's not cut off at the top. That is what it is, and that is that. Okay, so let us move on with the next thing that the Mishnah tells us, and that's the last thing of today, and that is the size of the lulav. Right, and we'll discuss this in all the Daled Minim. But the end of the Mishnah is lulav sheish by shloisha tefachim kedei l'nerboy is considered to be kosher. That's what it is. Rashi explained the 3 tefachim on the shedra next to the hadas, and you have an extra teva to shake it. We'll see later in the Gemara Lamed Beis on base talks about the hadas as well. We'll get to that b'siyata d'shmaya. But basically, it means that the share of the lulav, and we measure the spine, not the leaves, is 4 tefachim. And the reason why the Gemara wanted the lulav to be higher than the hadas is, like Rashi tells us, because it's higher than the rest, and also because that is where it's tied together to the hadassim, and therefore that's the reason for that. What exactly are the shurim we're dealing with? So according to the Chazon Ish, it's 40 centimeters, Rav Moshe 38.1, Rav Chaim Noah 32, whatever. Again, we're not going to go into too much of this, because at the end of the day, most of our lulavim fit in to these measurements. There's not so much of a shaila with that case. Is there a maximum share for a lulav? So the Shulchan Aruch base, the Siddur Yavitz, the Aruch Shulchan say there is no maximum share to the length of lulav. However kosher, however long it is kosher. However, famous Mogen Avraham, Rabbi Say, top Reish Ayin base brings down, it's actually in Hilchos Chanukah, where it brings also the same idea as well. And that is, there's a hiddah to have a much longer one as well. We've all seen probably pictures and videos of Reb Chaim Kanievsky Shlita. Should live and be well. For Grant's Klal Yisrael, with this huge mashal that comes from the Mogen Avram. In fact, interestingly enough, the Turi Even, Chagiga Dav Zayin, or Chashulchan, and others say that actually there are many Marmakomis, in fact, to say there's no hiddah to have it longer, whatever. But the idea is basically that it should be very long, straight, nice, look good, look healthy, look geschmack. That's pretty much what we are dealing with over here. But Siyat Dishmaya, and like I said, we measure from the spine and not from anything else. So that is pretty much that. So we've discussed much of the Mishnah in today's Daf Chavtes. There's many more shilas to discuss, even within the Lulav, and then obviously getting to the Esrog and the Hadassim and the Arovas. Got a tremendous amount to do. I'm very, very excited. Thank you so much for joining this brand new series. I'm excited together with you to join along with this journey. Like I said, if you want to sponsor a future share, please send us an email, office@beisdovid, BEIS, Dovid.com. You can sponsor a future share. You can listen to my Daf Yomi share, which is on Spotify, which is on Apple Podcasts, Google Music, and Torah Anytime. And I have an app as well, the Rabbi Avi Wiesenfeld app. You can download on Apple or Android for free. Thank you so much for listening. You should all be matzliach, and we look forward to next time, Be'ezus Hashem.